Christine Beckman. I'm a professor at the Price School of Public Policy associated with the Center for Social Innovation. Today's session is being hosted actually by the Center for Social Innovation, by the Department of Governance and Management, as well as for our Center for Philanthropy and Public Policy. So this is a broad audience, excited to have our speakers today. We're really coming together to celebrate the launching of the third edition of the Nonprofit Sector Research Handbook, now in its third edition, the first edition being 1987. So we thought we were joking that we should ask how many of you were born when that first edition came out, but I think to avoid making Woody feel older than he is, we will not do that. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So the handbook has been edited by Woody Powell for all three iterations with different co-authors. Woody is a professor at Stanford, co-director of the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. And given that the first handbook was in 1987, I'll just suffice it to say he's sort of a leader in this space and has been doing important work for a long time in this area. We also have the two USC authors of chapters in this new handbook. We have Mike Ananny, who is associate professor of communication and journalism at the USC Annenberg School. He does work at the intersection of journalism and technology and on the public ethics of communication, as you'll sort of see when he talks a bit about his chapter. And then we have Nina Eliasoph, who is a professor of sociology in the Dornsife school. So I'm glad that everyone could join, and we could highlight in particular the USC authors in the handbook. So I thought it would be easiest and best to start off and give you each a few minutes just to tell us about your chapters. There is a Q&A available, so if at any point, if our listeners would like to chime in with a question, we'll be moderating those and trying to add those in as we go. I have a set of questions to ask that I can start us off, but feel free to add in questions as you have. We do also have a poll that we thought it would be useful for our speakers to have a sense of who our audience was, so they could make sure they were speaking and explaining the things that they should explain. So if you could answer that poll as you join, that would be terrific. We will leave that up for a few more minutes. But why don't I please start and introduce Woody Powell. Thank you, Woody, for sharing the handbook with us. And how about you start and tell us a little bit about your particular chapter, and then we can go to the handbook itself and the themes of the overall handbook later.
Okay. Thank you, Christine. Well, as editor, you get to call the shots. And even if you're a co-editor, you still can twist the arm of your co-editor, in this case, Patricia Bromley. So I got to write two chapters. And there's an introduction. It's not a typical introduction that explains what's going on in the volume. Instead, it's a kind of wide-ranging introduction that asks, what is civil society? It asks, what does it mean to call something not for profit? How do you define something with an absence? And it asks, how does the third sector differ around the world? And so can we think of civil society, nonprofits, the so-called third sector? Are we really comparing apples and oranges, or is there a way to think consistently about the sector and its role? So that's, sort of the landscape of the introduction. And then with Aaron Horvath, I wrote a chapter called Seeing Like a Philanthropist. And this was a wonderful experience working with Aaron. We wrote essentially a political history of the ultra-wealthy philanthropy. And it begins from Rockefeller to Chan Zuckerberg, from Carnegie to Laurene Powell Jobs, and raises the question of, do we live in a new gilded age of inequality? And so much is the same in terms of what the ultra-rich do with their philanthropy, but a lot of things are different. And so we try to reflect on that. We look at how Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, coming out of industries of extraction, built things with brick and mortar. They built universities and museums and libraries. And then in the 21st century with Gates, with Bezos and others, you see how much their philanthropy comes out of the tech world and out of the world of venture capital, where they think there's, an app for solutions to social problems, and where they develop new models and new metrics to understand their philanthropy. So this is a 150-year sweep of the history of philanthropy.
Terrific, terrific. Mike, how about you? You introduce us to your chapter.
Sure, yeah. Thanks very much, Christine, for putting this together, and to the folks at Price, and to Woody and Tricia for being included in the volume. It's a total treat. My work tends to think a lot about how public life forms, and for me, a lot of the reason I study journalism and news and sort of the cultures of production is as a way into this question of how public life, how civic life is created and formed. And thinking about this chapter, which comes in this section of nonprofits and advocacy, I was joking with Woody and Tricia at first that's actually, it's a very uncomfortable position to ask journalists, their position to advocacy. Usually what happens is journalists are very quick to say, I don't advocate for anything. I don't have an interest in here at all. And we know through years of sociology of sort of studying news organizations that, well, there are some interests there. Those interests take different forms, and they look different in different eras, but they're definitely there. The other thing I try to do in the chapter is distinguish between sort of three levels of analysis. It's really this idea of studying news, studying journalism, or studying the press. And what the chapter tries to do is sort of focus on the press as an institutional a set of institutional conditions that give rise to news as a product and give rise to journalism as a practice. But when I sort of was thinking this question through that Woody and Tricia sort of posed of how could we think about the press as an institution of advocacy in relation to nonprofit sector and the civil society, it struck me that there were sort of three buckets to this three answers to this question of, how to think about news and advocacy. The first is sort of thinking about journalists say they're advocating for nothing. There's this strong norm of saying they're giving up on any sort of form of interest, that all the job of journalists to do is to provide information, and it's up to the citizenry, it's up to audiences to do what they want with that information. And it's this sort of idea of distancing as much as possible. But of course, even claiming to advocate for nothing is a kind of advocating for something, because it's a notion of investing in that information model. The other sort of bucket to this answer is often journalists will say, well, I'm advocating for, quote, healthy public life, or I'm advocating for strong communities. And they'll sort of use these sort of tropes that can take different forms in the form of explanation or analysis that news can do. Sometimes news can be investigation and accountability holding work. Sometimes it can be sort of convening, an act of sort of hosting a public discourse or amplifying voices that perhaps haven't been as strongly held. So that's a kind of another way that we see advocacy playing out in news. The third bit is where a lot of my work tends to focus on, though, is I think there's this other dimension where journalists are increasingly advocating for their own autonomy. They're advocating for, it's sort of what Chris Kelty talks about as a recursive public power. It's advocating for the power to make themselves as an institution, to decide what counts or doesn't count, to who gets to be in the field or isn't in the field, and what forces shape it. So that's where I sort of focus from the chapter, is to say, what kind of public-making power does the institutional press have today, and how does it pursue particular types of publics as it courts funders, as it sets up revenue streams, as it tries to figure out when should you be independent from or dependent upon a wealthy donor or a foundation or a crowdsourced community or a paywall technology. There's sort of this story, I think, of institutional autonomy of the press in relation to these forces, these fields that it historically has not really had to struggle much with. So that's where the chapter sort of tries to position itself, is to say, what kind of public life do we get as journalists are doing this little dance where they're trying to figure out who should I depend upon, who should I distance myself from? And I was sort of seeing the nonprofit sector as a place where that dance is happening. And I can get more into detail maybe in the questions on the different types of funding. But that was the way I sort of approached that uncomfortable question of advocating for what that Tricia would pose.
Terrific. All right, Nina, please.
Yeah. So thanks for organizing this. It's really great to be able to have this conversation at USC with a whole bunch of people in different departments. My chapter was about volunteering in nonprofits. And so my first thought was, why do we care? What's so great about volunteers? And as soon as you start to think that, you realize, oh, because they're supposed to do pretty much everything wonderful. They're both supposed to help people directly. They're also supposed to become good citizens in themselves. And volunteering is supposed to be a kind of, what Tocqueville called this schools for democracy for the volunteers. They're also possibly supposed to advocate for policy changes that will benefit people. A lot of people who do social enterprise have an idea that volunteers also should be learning how to be independent in the market, make money, be self-improving, rise up upward social mobility. So, there's so many goals for what a volunteer should do. And the idea with getting them in nonprofits is that all these good things will just naturally arise and they're all harmonious. But my own work, which is ethnographic, has shown that actually it's always really hard to get all those things happening at once. So my chapter kind of uses a small bit of my work, but also a lot of ethnographies from around the world, showing the kind of dilemmas between these different agendas. And the reason that it's interesting to use ethnography is, if people don't know what ethnography is, it's kind of just spending time with the people who are doing the task. They're trying to teach volunteers how to make money doing some social enterprise, while they're also trying to get them to look at the big picture of democracy, while they're also trying to provide some direct aid for somebody who needs help today, not next year when they've already started making money, while they're also trying to do all these other things. So my chapter was kind of looking at a lot of different ethnographic studies. The other thing about ethnography, is that the person who's doing the study themselves should have a role in that organization that they're studying and be in it over, months, if not years, and just observe interactions. And that's where the sort of interesting, where the rubber hits the road, because that's where you see how hard it is to do all these things at once. That's my chapter. I messed up the whole category.
Yeah, well, so I have follow-up questions for all of you. Why don't I do a few of those actually before I sort of give you some, I want to go back, Woody, and ask you some big picture questions as well, but around the handbooks and the evolution. But thinking about the chapter, the introduction that you talked about, thinking about what is the role of nonprofits, as we think, we've seen increasing public-private partnerships and collaborations. We also see an increasing number of nonprofits with a social mission. And so I'm curious, what is the role of nonprofits here? And is social innovation and new ideas, is that moving out of the nonprofit sector? So sort of what's the play for why nonprofits are really an important organizational form to understand?
Well, one might argue that actually social innovation began in the nonprofit sector, and the rest of the world is slowly catching up. And the sort of fundamental question remains, can a nonprofit become more like a business or government and not lose its soul, not lose its mission? Businesses can adopt a social mission, and many have. Fundamentally, B Corps are among the ones that have done it, and there's some discussion of purpose among businesses and whatnot. but they could drop that tomorrow and it wouldn't affect their primary activity. And I think that's the sort of fundamental piece to think about when there's cross-sector collaboration. What are the different roles for the different kinds of organizations? And there's several chapters in the volume that try to think about this. I think one of the most interesting is by Christoph Brandner and what cities are taking a role in combating climate change, and how do we think about, what cities are in the lead in this regard. And unfortunately, not many cities are taking a role, but those that are, they find that in the cities that start doing this, the source of the change always begins in a nonprofit organization. So it's a library or a foundation, or a Y that decides to build a green building, and they go first, and then slowly government starts taking what was a target and develops policy to make those kind of a ladder in which others climb. And then they find that chain businesses, things like Starbucks, remarkably, start adopting green policies. And once the chain adopts green policies, more and more things get on board. And slowly this process happens. But they show very carefully that in cities where it doesn't begin in the nonprofit sector, progress gets halted. If you're only dependent on the public sector or the private sector, you don't get this mobilizing process. So that's a really important, I think, insight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, terrific. Well, and sort of follow up on that a little bit. And I think, Nina, this is really for all of you. And I know, Nina, your work in civic and political organizations may be relevant here. But one of the questions in the chat so far from David Salazar is about what is the role for nonprofits in particular in promoting equity and justice, certainly a topic that's been top of mind. So is there a particular role for nonprofits in that space? So really it's an open question to whoever might want to respond.
Well, one thought I had was actually sort of bouncing off of Woody, is that I think it's possible that one of the things nonprofits do best is pressure the government to take over doing what the nonprofit one had been doing. So, nonprofits that get volunteers to go do home visits to elderly people who need help. So there's these studies in the Netherlands, for example. The government said, okay, we do too much for social welfare. We're going to devolve all this to nonprofits and volunteers. And some of the nonprofits are saying, well, okay, now our new job is actually to get the government to start doing this again, because frankly, volunteers can't do this. You need paid people who will be there regularly and have some sort of monetary coercion making them come back every single day to help the disabled person. So that's one of my thoughts, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess also on this advocacy question, Mike, sort of, if we think about how media has changed and sort of how that business model has been disrupted, and a lot of nonprofits sort of and philanthropy sort of taking on and owning news organizations, does that influence sort of the nature of advocacy and sort of what you were speaking to in your chapter as well? Are there sort of upsides, downsides, there are guardrails that we need if we're going to think about philanthropy owning news organizations?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And even so, for news organizations, the phrase nonprofit was, historically was sort of an ugly word, because news organizations were returning such amazing profits for so long. They were giving back, a good news organization was giving back, 18, 20, 25% returns. So there was sort of this question of why would a news organization possibly be nonprofit when it was such a great profit generating vehicle? So I think a lot of sort of an earlier generation of news owners were sort of schooled in that way of thinking. So that the relationship to a nonprofit as a concept, or even philanthropy as a source of funding, is a little bit new. And I think there's two broad buckets in a way that I sort of see sometimes in that relationship to philanthropy. The first is sort of almost sort of a direct funding relationship, where if you can build a relationship with a donor that I'm thinking of, Omidyar Foundation and the Intercept, for example. But if you can build a relationship with a wealthy person who has an interest in supporting a particular type of journalism, then that can be a way to do it. Or the Chandler family, is another example. So there are histories of sort of that kind of the foundations as a way to achieving financial stability in a world where advertising and subscription revenue, which were the two historical sources of revenue for news organizations, both of those, advertising and subscription, have gone under seismic shifts as news has gone online. So one is sort of this direct relationship, and I think in the direct relationship there's a lot of questions to ask around. What the most obvious is does the donor have an interest in a particular type of journalism or a particular type of news production? In a way, that's almost the low-hanging fruit question, and usually that question of interest rarely presents itself in an explicit or obvious way. We know from studies of ownership of news organizations that usually it's a much more sort of subtle, tacit, implicit kind of influence that happens, and that's what we see. But so there's a lot of that, the direct funding relationship there. The other, though, I think, which is almost a more wonderfully messy kind of space that I think is still forming, is almost the role of philanthropies and foundations in convening the field of journalism. And that field convening activity is taking the form of putting together universities and healthcare institutions to do reporting on medical issues or climate issues or something, so that foundations can often sort of bring together voices and organizational resources that weren't convened before. But there's also a lot of interest sometimes among foundations and philanthropies on saying, providing sort of project-specific funding to news organizations to say, why don't we help you develop a better paywall, a better subscription model, a better relationship to advertisers? Maybe it's crowdsourcing. Maybe it's actually advocating to try to use tax policy to provide sort of tax relief for news organizations. So there's sort of almost like an institutional convening, institutional advocacy kind of work, where I think that's where a lot of the more sort of almost interesting and dynamic questions arise. The old questions of sort of, is a rich person influencing coverage? In a way, it's kind of like that question is sort of too simple and too explicit to rarely present itself in an interesting way.
So Woody, let's go back to it's interesting to think about, I think I'm hearing from all of you sort of the role of nonprofits in the ecosystem in terms of what they can convene, what they can pressure the organizations to do, how they can lead social change. As someone who's edited all the editions of this handbook, Woody, what are your reflections on how the field has evolved? That that this new volume is heavier, bigger, has a more diverse set of perspectives, perhaps than earlier editions. What do you see in terms of how this field has evolved and the leaps across the volumes?
Sure, you didn't say it's also more beautiful, so it's really a lovely book, and it's the lowest price it's ever been, which is pretty remarkable. So I talk a little bit, I reflect on the changes in the introduction. The first volume was devoted to mapping the sector. Almost all the authors at the time were with me at Yale at the program on nonprofit organizations. POMPO was kind of the first academic center to study nonprofits. And it may be hard to imagine, but we were working in the wake of a very famous commission, the Filer Commission, and Congressional Tax Reform Act, that actually legitimated entities as different as soup kitchens, art museums, United Ways, the Rockefeller Foundation is part of the same field. They had not previously been treated the same under the tax code, and suddenly they were. And nobody knew what it was. Was it a third sector? Was it a place between the state and the market? So the volume thought a lot about what's called market failure and government failure, and asking what makes nonprofits different. Of course, they can earn fees. They can even be rich. Yale was rich, obviously, but they could not redistribute profits or put the money left over at the end of the year in their pocket. And so the theme was sort of, what kind of theory do we need to understand these types of organizations? The second edition, which is from the early part of this century, was sort of located in Indiana at the new Center on Philanthropy at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis. And I worked closely with Richard Steinberg on that volume. Richard's an economist, and so not focus on nonprofits in the marketplace, on nonprofits and earned income, fee for services, growing professionalization and managerialism of the sector. The sector was becoming a thing where people would devote careers to. And there was a lot of talk in the volume about what happens to altruism and what happens to mission when survival is at stake. But that volume had a, I don't want to say, yeah, I guess it's fair to say, a functional focus. It thought about education, social services, the arts. Mike, there was a discussion by Paul DiMaggio saying, why isn't the press nonprofit? We raised that question, religion and the like. So the third edition, I worked on, obviously, with Patricia Bromley. Patricia's a comparativist, an international scholar. And we went to some links to make sure this volume has more of a global focus, more global concerns. And we also look much more at the dark side of nonprofits. So there's a chapter by Dupuy and Prakash on what happens to developing nations when they begin to lose their sovereignty, when they're overwhelmed by international non-governmental organizations. There's a chapter on social enterprises in Europe and China by Johanna Mayer. And there's a chapter on social movements around the world. So there's much more of a global orientation. There's a lot more focus, as Mike's chapter represents, on advocacy. There's advocacy by nonprofits, which used to not happen as much. There's discussion of use of the nonprofit form for advocacy. Ed Walker at UCLA is written on AstroTurf organizations, how oil companies form nonprofits to promote, their green image. And then Mike's chapter sort of asks, advocacy for what and whom. So that's a different kind of focus. We pay more attention to kind of the role of nonprofits and civic capacity. So there's a wonderful chapter on immigrant organizations and civic invisibility, things that aren't studied. There's work on urban partnerships, as I mentioned before. And when we do think about functions in this chapter, whether it's healthcare or the arts, the themes are very much inclusion and access. Who can go, what makes a difference to be a nonprofit. And there, I'll just give a plug for Crosstown contributor Jill Horowitz at UCLA. She has a superb chapter on healthcare, where she points out maybe the thing you look at is not differences in services, like who is taken care of in a public or for-profit or nonprofit hospital, but what isn't done. And she shows in her chapter, for example, vastly lower rates of voluntary surgeries, things like hysterectomies, for example, in nonprofit hospitals, while in for-profit hospitals, much greater, because these are things that generate revenue and earn income. So often when you think about nonprofits, you have to think about the things they don't do that for-profits do, rather than this kind of straight comparison. So it's a very different volume, as you suggested, not just in looks and weight, but certainly intellectually. It's a much more ambitious agenda, I think.
Terrific. Well, so sort of just to follow up on that, one of the questions here from Adrian seems to sort of follow on that and maybe the evolution of the volume and how we think about nonprofits. But again, so this is a question really for anyone who wants to tackle it. But do any of you believe that the need for philanthropy and nonprofit work to evoke positive social change is an indicator of government failure, and why or why not? So what's the link between government failure and philanthropy and nonprofits? It's been highlighted a bit, I think, in some of the questions, the answers that you've already given. But
I'll take a quick stab, but please, Nina and Mike, join in. In our philanthropy chapter, we point out that throughout much of the second part of the 20th century, nonprofits were kind of these laboratories for experimentation. They would try out programs to see if they would work, whether it was daycare, whether it was preschool education, whether it was different times of welfare reform. And if they worked in a particular city, they would turn to government to scale them. And that was sort of kind of the relationship. So what philanthropy and nonprofits did was try out various kinds of social programs, passed on and became part of the broader public services. Today, that relationship is, I think, changed dramatically. And so what you see with philanthropy, whether from the Walton family or the Broad family or, Gates as well, is disruptive philanthropy that is, if you will, anti-state and thinks that philanthropists, foundations, and nonprofits can do things differently and maybe better than government. So there's not much less of this, we'll try it here and pass it on. It's rather, we know how to do it better. And that began a bit with, back in the era of Ronald Reagan, but it certainly got amplified in the 21st century.
Well, I'll take a kind of contentious stab at that question, which is, for one thing, not to quote Bernie Sanders directly, but the very existence of a billionaire shows a policy failure. I mean, there shouldn't be people who, Jeff Bezos during the pandemic made so much that if he paid all of his employees $105,000 bonus for the past 6 months, he'd still come out ahead. That is an example of a policy failure. So, okay, never mind about that, because that wasn't exactly high social theory. It was just an observation. But then more kind of speaking as a scholar, in my own ethnographic research, for one of my books, I spent 4.5 years with people who ran after-school programs and civic engagement programs for young people. And over the course of that time, the employees in these places moved in and out of nonprofit and government organizations. And then in between jobs, they would volunteer. And there wasn't much difference between their actions and in the different sectors. So I think that with the sort of increase in the need for the professionalization and kind of more managerial ethic of a lot of nonprofits, they're really not that different from government. And in a way, a lot of government organizations have a little more flexibility because their timelines are longer and they don't have to keep documenting to their donors that they've had successes that actually can't be documented in the course of 3 months or a year, because they're long-term goals, like this kid will develop a good citizen ethic and also will go to college. So I'm not sure that division is even that useful right now.
Does it differ in different places in the world? I know, Woody, you said a lot of this third handbook sort of took a more global perspective. How should we think about nonprofits? Are there any broad trends you can talk about what the role of that sector is across the world?
I'm nervous about trying to give a soundbite on this because it's a fascinating but really difficult piece to unpack. I'm involved in a project now studying civic life in 7 cities around the world: Singapore, Sydney, Taipei, Shenzhen, China, Seattle, San Francisco, and Vienna. And of course, the sector looks different across those cities. In Vienna, there's much more a kind of fraternal membership nature to nonprofits, sports clubs. In Shenzhen, there's, migrant associations are really important. Elder care is super important. But I think in every case, one could hazard that, directly to Nina's comment, that the larger the footprint of the state in coordinating and delivering and providing a whole array of services, the smaller the autonomous role of nonprofits. So or retreats, as we've seen in the US context in recent years, the scale of nonprofits grows. And so that's, in Indiana, where the state provides very heavily for its citizens, you see the nonprofits, the character of nonprofits being more fraternal and associational than service-based nonprofits.
I could jump in a little bit on that question as well, if it's helpful. And it was sort of actually do back even a little bit of connecting with the government failure question as well, because I think that in a news or journalism context, the question of what constitutes government failure, or has there been a government failure in relation to it, that answer looks different depending on the country or the cultural context that you want to look at. So in the US, there's been a very sort of, historically complicated and contentious relationship between the idea of an independent press and a state, going back to, even thinking about the party press era in the 1700s and, actual political organizations sponsoring journalism, all the way through to, when journalism scholars often talk about the relationship to the press, there's mention of, used to be you could get, in some states, you could get ink for without being taxed. If you were using that ink to create a newspaper, then there was sort of a tax exemption for that ink. Minnesota did that for a very long time. Even the very idea of media mail, like being able to send something around the country at a cheaper rate, was originally, part of the idea that a good, healthy democracy has a free flow of information, and the government has an interest in making sure that there's a low-cost channel to do that, and newspapers benefited from that for a long time, getting to ship newspapers all over the place. There was also the example of a little bit more of a controversial one, but exemptions for labor laws for literally newspaper boys, and they were usually boys, newspaper boys being able to, that was the distribution mechanism that news organizations relied on for a long time, and they were exempt from labor laws that said you couldn't ask children to work long hours, and newspapers said, well, this is our distribution mechanism. And so we've seen sort of different examples where I think government has played a role in the institutional structures of the press, but where I would pinpoint perhaps a failure, and maybe that's too strong a word to say failure, is almost sort of a suspicion or a disinterest on the part of the state in relation to US media. So, we had the Minnow report, we had sort of the Hutchins Commission, we've had sort of moments when there have been sort of, principled interventions into media systems. I don't think we see that anymore. If anything, we're sort of in a political, almost partisan discourse right now, where anything that smacks of a government or a state subsidy or support or scaffold for anything that looks like the media, instantly gets transformed into an idea of, well, this is the state's media, because we don't have a model of, the BBC or the CBC or ABC in Australia have these sort of well-worn institutional mechanisms for thinking about the difference between funding and editorial independence. And they're imperfect for sure. They're not always working, ideally. But where I do see, if you call it a failure, is that in the US, there's been less of an investment to figure out how would we build the institutional norms and practices and sort of forms of reciprocity that might set up a publicly supported media system. It doesn't have to look like BBC or CBC or ABC. It could have an American quality, but there's been almost a failure to even attend to that as a potential. And so that's for me the disappointment in a way in terms of government failure for the US.
It's interesting, Mike. It's maybe a side conversation, but you get much less discussion or claims of fake news in Canada, Australia, Britain, precisely because of legitimacy of a national media.
Yeah.
follow up that with you, Mike, again. I mean, sort of this question about sort of in the U.S. what kind of public is journalism, in service of, and you've studied technology and algorithms and platforms, and how that impacts that. So, can you talk a little bit more about that in the U.S. context?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think especially sort of economists and media scholars have often talked about, news as sort of this double-sided market where you're trying to, create a product or experience that works for advertisers, but you were also trying to create something that worked for readers, and you'd get subscription revenue from one and you'd get advertising revenue from the other. And what I think we've seen in the last, rapidly in almost the last 5 to 10 years is almost this third entrant into that conversation, which is in the form of platforms and social media and technology companies that they're not quite audiences, they're not quite advertisers, they're somewhere in the middle here, but news organizations sort of ignore them at their peril. So when I increasingly almost don't talk about the press anymore without trying to talk about it as this networked press, which is sort of this assemblage of professional practices, but also algorithmic systems, data services, kind of a host of technological systems. Even the design of paywalls is sort of a field in itself that news organizations, they used to either, cost 35 cents for a newspaper, or it did not cost 35 cents for a newspaper. There was no sense of maybe we should, make it 20 cents sometimes or 50 cents another time. So I think the questions of sort of how do we fund the press and what is the role of nonprofits in that funding conversation is absolutely inseparable from the role that tech companies are playing, not as broadcasters, not as audiences, not as advertisers, but as people who are sort of creating the conditions under which news circulates or doesn't circulate, or journalism happens or doesn't happen. So they're very much part of the conversation, but historically we've seen, even, Facebook and Google, various times they've said things like, well, they're off this a little bit now, but they've variously said, we're a technology company, we're not a media company, or we don't produce content, we just, we're a common carrier for your content. Increasingly, that contention, I think, doesn't hold water. I think we're well past that conversation. But what we have is sort of a little bit of a vacuum of what should this network press look like? How should it configure itself? And those are normative questions that are related to a conception of the public that I try to sort of get into in the chapter of, the answer to that question of how should all of this assemblage be arranged. The answer to that question depends on what the heck you mean by public and what do you want public to be. So for me, that's where the richer question becomes.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. So to switch gears a bit, there was an early question, Nina, about volunteering and sort of with the premise of, why aren't there more people volunteering and what does the future of volunteering look like? And I want to sort of piggyback on that and sort of ask us an even broader question, which is, given how the nonprofit sector has changed over this period of time, how are the types of volunteers we rely on different today than they were 50 years ago? And how has that evolution happened and where do you see that going in the future?
Yeah, it's interesting because wherever you look, now or 50 years ago, there were dilemmas. So 50 years ago, there were a lot of volunteers in social services were kind of women whose husband supported them, like upper middle class women. And Arlene Kaplan Daniels wrote this classic called Invisible Careers. And it was about these women who kind of dedicated their lives to working with a family over years, the same family, and the women volunteers would become kind of more experienced in a way than, well, not in a way, actually more experienced and more knowledgeable than younger professionals who'd come in and tell them what to do, but they already knew what to do. So there was this gender issue going on and a class issue going on because who could afford to volunteer that much? And they were required to make a really strong commitment, sometimes including an 18-month training program beforehand. So that's the then like long-term, and stratified by gender and class. Fast forward to now, and it's the sort of accelerated society. Like everything's faster, so there's a lot of people I'd call like plug-in volunteers. They can just sort of plug in, plug out. Like I actually had a student who said, I went to Ghana for 2 days and volunteered in an orphanage, and it was so meaningful. And I thought, oh my gosh, okay, how could this possibly be meaningful for the orphans, to bond with you for 2 days and then you leave? So, so there's other dilemmas, which are a lot about sort of the temporality of volunteering, and that's kind of a big shift. Robert Wethnow has called it, I forgot the word, not sporadic, episodic volunteering. Similar thing, so kind of fast. That's one of the big changes. Another is, the boundary between volunteering and activism or advocacy has always been one that, I can't actually tell you how it's changed, because part of it depends on how the observer, the scholar, is measuring where the boundary is. And so there hasn't been a consistent measure over time that could account for things. Partly for changes, partly because more of life has become sort of under political scrutiny. Robert Dahl, writing in the 50s or 60s, I guess, made a list of like things that of course are not politics: family, love, romance, child raising, nature. What else is on the list? It was just hilarious. It was like one after another. I'm like, nope, all politics. So it would be hard to keep that boundary consistent over time, because precisely it changes because of advocacy usually. So.
All right, so I'm going to turn to a couple of the questions in the chat. I'm going to actually pair two of them together here, and sort of there's some themes clearly in the questions that are reflecting some of the conversation we've had. So Bill Rash asked, to what extent does the push towards philanthropy and nonprofits as implementation solutions, anti-statist, as Powell put it, undermine governmental capacity to solve the same issues and exacerbate moral hazard issues in the deregulation of policy responsibility? So again, I feel like we touched on this a little bit, but a more direct a question on that. And then Valentina asked to go back to something that you said, Nina, about public policy failures. And if public policies were as effective and efficient as they're expected to be, would the nonprofit sector still exist? All right, so I think there's just a lot of questions here around sort of this relationship between the nonprofit and public policy and the public sector. Anyone want to tackle that?
I could jump in on the Valentina's question. The example that Woody gave of Vienna is like a lot of Europe, where there's nonprofits that have theater groups and art programs and sports, and they get together and across classes sometimes, and whatever it is they're doing, it's not urgently solving a problem of life and death usually. Ours tend sometimes more often than theirs to be, I don't know, correct me, Woody,
No. At the front lines of life and death. Mm-hmm.
Right, at the front lines of life and death. It's mutual aid. Like right now, there are people handing out food for homeless people and water for homeless people. It's stuff that doesn't need to be done in Europe, because they're not as much, nowhere near as much, because the state provides for housing and water, for example, and food, more or less. So in some ways, those kinds of nonprofits, the ones that are about matters of life and death, are examples of policy failures, to answer your question. But the ones that are about, things that aren't matters of life and death, getting together to do something that betters the society, of course they should exist. But in a less managerial way than ours do is the other thing. So in a way, just oh boy, you're all going to kill me, but just having the kind of volunteer groups that aren't really funded would help with that. But those are not things that people can make money from. So it would require that's the other thing about our nonprofit sector versus that of, well, Finland. I'm just giving an example because I have a co-author who I'm writing something about that with, where her volunteers in the nonprofit sector can just not have a job. And so they don't use their volunteering as a stepping stone toward a career. They're just doing what they think is most effective. Ours, in the same arena, which we're studying together, which is bike activism. I mean, we were before the pandemic, but ours are all using it as a way to get ahead, to get a job. And so it really affects what you're doing as a volunteer, because you don't want to do something too controversial. You don't want to, you want to try to do something that'll forward your career. Hers in Finland are much more open because they already get money from the state to live, not well, but on an okay level for long periods of time without having any job at all or working part-time.
Yeah, one thing really follows on Nina's comment. If we look across the 7 cities we're studying, the sharpest divide, the biggest cleavage in terms of types of organizations is between nonprofits where there's a full-time paid executive director versus a part-time volunteer executive director. And that's it's like a canyon between them. Those that are full-time and paid are purposeful, motivated, instrumental, and they live in a world that's essentially no metrics, no money. It almost sounds like a reggae song, but that's not from the Bay Area. That song actually comes from Shenzhen, China. That message of, your nonprofit will get funding if it develops an app, if it finds a way to check the health on a daily basis of elder care citizens, if it finds a way to open WeChat accounts for homeless so that they can keep track of them and how much they're eating. And so the one side of the sector is overwhelmingly, organized around, we have a task to do, we're measured on that task. If we meet our goals, we'll get more funding. And the question the really interesting question in the chat room is, what is the relationship of that to something just side by side? Nina's comments throughout have been this. Many of these activities in some places and historically have been carried out by governments. In the US and some other countries, as they're increasingly carried out by nonprofits, do they become arms of government, or do they undermine confidence in the public sector? And this goes to Mike's question of what is the public? If you have a well-functioning nonprofit, whether for daycare or school or homeless shelters, does the government not do its job then, or does it see that no longer as part of its job? I think that political tension is really that's a frontier question to be looking at.
I would link to that and say that in the journalism news space, there's the question is less about sort of the role of government or nonprofits in service delivery. So it's not a question of the government, somebody from the state should be writing that story that nobody's writing, or that we need a department of investigative journalism, in the executive. That's less the conversation, I think, for obvious reasons, but more, especially in this tech world, it's usually the absence of government policy. So a lot of time we've just seen sort of silence or inaction on public policy around technology and free speech, or technology and self-regulation. Within some of the worlds I travel in, there's a very hot topic or debate around the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of whether platforms should have this sort of safe harbor from, or this ability to sort of define what they think content moderation looks like, to sort of decide when to moderate content or not moderate content, and to self-regulate on what those rules should be. And the CDA 230 was this pretty, sort of Clinton era gift to the technology industry to say, self-regulate, don't worry about being responsible for speech that's carried on your platform. I think what we're seeing now, and that sort of quote unquote worked for a long time because it allowed the Googles and the Facebooks of the world and the Twitters to sort of rise up without that need to moderate. But in the absence of sort of strong government policy to think about the conditions that give rise to journalism, we're now sort of, I think, playing catch up. The U.S. is far behind Europe and other jurisdictions in terms of thinking about what good policy looks like in the tech space. So connecting to William's question in the chat, that was sort of one that's not direct service delivery of the state, but that is the state's silence, I guess, on policy or inability to execute policy.
Terrific. So I want to make sure we're going to run out of time here, and I want to make sure that I ask you, Woody, sort of about what the future holds, and sort of what you see in the tea leaves for the 4th edition, or maybe what's on the horizon in terms of sort of the intellectual development. I think it's fascinating to hear how the handbook has shifted over the different editions, and given how the world has changed, and so what do you see going forward?
Well, I was going to say, 1, thank you for hosting, and 2, thank you for thinking I'll be around when there's a 4th edition. So I appreciate that we'll all be around. I think a lot of the questions we're asking are questions about, boundaries and missions. And so those are really important questions. And this volume starts thinking about what we call entanglements, and the way in which nonprofits and government and the market and social enterprises are entangled. And I think we'll want to think much more about, what are the effects of those entanglements. And, as I listen to Nina talk, and in a different way, Mike, I think about the question of what I call community embeddedness. How much do volunteers reflect the community that they're a part of? How much are volunteers like the people they serve? Nina pointed to the student who went to Ghana. Obviously not a native, and also not someone who's going to be involved in long-term care of the orphan. And so, really interesting questions about, do the people who work in nonprofits look like the people they serve? And do they look like the community in which they exist in? And I think that, to me, is, if you want to think about the survival of this organizational form, that's at the core of what it's going to be.
Terrific. Can I give Nina and Mike? So Woody will still be around, but your thoughts about sort of going forward as well? Anything you'd like to close with before we sign off?
I would echo. Actually, I think connects really well to the last point Woody was making. That's a really sort of urgent debate in the news industry right now. Is, will newsrooms and the field of journalism look like and be accountable to and include the communities, the publics, the issues that it's aiming to serve? And that could happen in a lot of different ways. And volunteer is one way. Organizational forms are one way. But that's the crux, I think, of what's being debated right now in terms of the future of news, is exactly that question.
Well, it seems like, especially with the loss of a lot of local news,
Yep.
Particularly important. Yeah, Nina, anything you would like to close us out with?
The idea of imagining the world in 15 years is just unfathomable. So I'm hoping that we're all working 3 hours a day and having the rest of our time to produce news and do volunteer work, and that's how it goes. And we'd have enough to go around, because we do, and there we'd be, and fires would be over, because we wouldn't be needing to consume and produce so much. So on that cheery note,
right, then we should get through 2020 first, right? Well, thank you to all of you for sharing the handbook with us and your chapters, and to have this great conversation about the nonprofit sector and the press and volunteering. And thank you all for joining us and asking your good questions.